All right, so thank you and good morning. I am Kate Landreth. I'm the Education and Learning Lead with Family Caregivers of BC. And you'll see the videos here this morning. We have my colleague, Stacey Dawes, and she is joining today to support in the chat box and the Q&A. And then I'm also joined today by Emma Donald. She's a registered clinical counselor in Victoria, BC. And today our webinar explores the cycles of negative thinking patterns we can get caught in, how to circuit break some of those cycles, and coping and self-care strategies to use in our daily life. And Emma, if you want to click forward. Wonderful. So as we begin our presentation today, one important piece of caregiver support is around self-awareness and acknowledgement. So a moment to remember to walk lightly, listen openly, and work mindfully on this unceded territory of the Lekwungen peoples and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanic First Nations, and or the land and place that you join from. So thank you for taking the time to share your acknowledgement. And then a piece about Family Caregivers, so who we are. So Family Caregivers of BC is a nonprofit. I'm going to get back to that, Emma. I know that this is the next slide, but if you want to flip actually 2 slides forward. Yeah, perfect. So Family Caregivers of BC is a nonprofit organization, and we're dedicated 100% to the well-being of family caregivers. And we have served caregivers across BC since 2010, and we're part of the Ministry of Health Patients as Partners initiative. So the second pillar of what we're going to talk about today is around caregiver support and education. And so that's where our webinars and lots of our great educational resources fall into. And this is really about engaging and connecting with caregivers with the intention to provide education on ways that you can resource yourself and support yourself as a caregiver. And then I'll get you to flip back just to the instructions of the webinar. So you're going to remain muted today, and your cameras are off. You can choose your screen name. The chat box is where we'll use some of our examples and feedback and reflections today. So please feel comfortable to type in that space when Emma might prompt you to. And also, if you feel like just taking in the information and not using the chat box, that's totally fine as well. The Q&A is more specific. If you have a specific question about something that Emma is speaking to, please ask it in that Q&A box. And the webinar is recorded, and so you'll be sent the recording and resources following the presentation. You also were sent yesterday around noon Pacific Standard Time a resource. It was coming from myself, Kate Landreth, and I in that attached a sheet that Emma will be using. And no worries, I know some people signed up in after that time, so you might not have received it. And so you might just want to follow along with drawing the template that Emma will explain for her resource. And that's all for me, and I'll hand it over now to Emma.
Great. Thank you so much, Kate and Stacey, for your support. And thank you to all of you. I wish I could look out and see all of your wonderful faces, but I'm going to assume you're all there here. It's such an honor to speak to this group today. So I'm just going to quickly go over who I am, why I'm here, what I do in my normal work as a counselor in private practice, just so you know where this information is coming from. So I work in private practice as a counselor in Victoria, BC. I see clients all across the province for a number of mental health related issues. I started my practice last February, so I've been in practice for about 1.5 years now. Prior to that, when I was completing graduate school, I did a practicum at a community mental health clinic here in Victoria, which exposed me to a huge variety of clients. So at that clinic, my youngest client was 18, my oldest client was almost 90. So that was so wonderful. It's sort of a cliche in the mental health world to say, you learn more from your clients than you could possibly ever offer them. But for me, that cliche was incredibly true. And yeah, I got exposed to folks who are dealing with grief and loss, life transitions, relationship issues, depression and anxiety, body image issues, trauma. And then, as many of you, I'm sure, will know in life, we often don't just deal with one of those issues. We also are living, breathing, existing people. And so often those things are interconnected or manifesting differently. So from that experience I had working in community mental health, I now see a lot of similar issues in my private practice. Prior to doing my master's training, I went to UVic and completed an undergraduate in psychology, which really equipped me to then pursue a master's in counseling through Yorkville University. I've always had an interest in what makes people tick, how we interact as human beings, and how to improve our life circumstances. So counseling felt like a very natural career for me to be drawn to. And it's been wonderful thus far. In addition to my interest in those areas, things that drew me to the field, I have worked in a number of helping roles. So I've done tons of childcare. I worked on a crisis support line, and I've provided peer counseling in the past. So sort of a bunch of different factors in my life brought me here. And then I kind of briefly touched on my practice areas already. So lots of coping strategies for depression and anxiety, lots of body image and disordered eating, grief and loss, and relationship issues as well. So quite general at this point in terms of what I see. And then outside of practice, I love to read. You can see in that picture there a few books, and I certainly love to read books related to mental health, and then also lots of fiction. I love to run and spend time outdoors and explore this beautiful province that we live in, and then spend time with friends and family as well. Okay, quick overview of what I will be covering today. So overall, we're going to be looking at what are the negative thinking patterns we all can fall into, how do those impact us. We'll be starting with doing a short guided meditation. This is something that I often use with my clients in session and then encourage folks to use outside of session too. So I'll be giving you a little taste of that. And then I will be providing an overview of negative thinking cycles. So what are they? How do we fall into them? And then a discussion of, okay, we've identified them. How are they impacting us, and what can we do to change them? What sort of coping strategies can we integrate, or how can we look at validating and then modifying those negative thoughts slightly to improve things? And then finally, as Kate mentioned, we'll be applying that to your own life in the form of the self-care wheel, which you all would have been emailed. If you don't have that email for whatever reason, I will be flashing up a version of it on my screen. So no worries there. You can just copy it onto a scrap piece of paper or something like that. Okay. So we are going to start here with the guided meditation. I do like to give a bit of a disclaimer. I'm sure some of you have experienced meditation or mindfulness before. Some of you, it might be brand new too. So I just want to emphasize there's no one right way to meditate. You don't need to clear your mind of all thoughts or do this perfectly. It's more so about trying to follow along with what I'm saying. And if you find your mind wandering, which is completely normal, just gently bringing your thoughts back to what I'm saying and to your breath and that sort of thing, as opposed to being perfectly monk-like. Okay, I can't see all of you, but I'm going to make the assumption that you're in a comfortable seat and you're able to close your eyes and take a few deep breaths, and we'll get started. Okay. To begin this practice, take a comfortable seat and gently close your eyes or soften your gaze. Take a few deep breaths. Take note of any sensations that may be coming up in your body. Perhaps you are clenching your teeth or jaw. Perhaps your shoulders are hunched. Could you try to relax them? And now, take note of any internal sensations, thoughts, emotions, or memories that are coming up for you. Try to view these as a passive observer would. Acknowledge their existence, but try not to latch onto them, judge them, or change them. Just try to allow them to exist and pass you by as a leaf might be blown in the wind. And now, let's return to the breath. Taking a long time to inhale, hold, and exhale several times. And now returning to your thoughts. What beliefs do you hold about this session, this day, the point that you're at in your life? Can you similarly take note of those thoughts and feelings without latching onto them? And again, trying to use that image of a leaf being blown past you. Return to the breath. In and out. And now, setting an intention for this session. Maybe it's to learn something new. Maybe it's to share an idea with the group in the chat. Maybe it's just to sit and take a moment for yourself in the midst of a busy week, month, or season of life. Take a moment to think of this intention or hope. Try to really name it and identify it. And then returning to your breath. A few final deep breaths. And when you're ready, you can come back to the morning. Okay, thank you everybody for being willing to try that with me. Let's get started on this. So I'm just going to do a quick overview here of what negative thinking actually is. So there's this idea in neuroscience that what fires together wires together. Essentially, what this means is the way in which our brain works, the things that we frequently do will wire together and create a really strong pathway, similar to a very well-trafficked highway. Likewise, things that we don't often think about or don't often do, for instance, like the French you took in grade 11 that you haven't thought about since, that would get pruned, and it would be like a really old forest road that has trees grown over it and is hard to navigate. So when we get into certain patterns of thinking, it can be easy to just go down the frequently traveled road and that to seem completely normal, that to be our automatic reaction. So some of what we will look at today is how can you figure out what that highway is in your mind, and are there other routes that you could consider starting to put some thought into, having it fire in that direction and then hopefully wire in that direction. So what this involves is first taking stock of what patterns you find yourself in. So, where do I go? What are the negative thoughts that are easy for me to fall back on? Why do I go there? And then figuring out ways to disrupt the patterns, challenge those beliefs, and then find alternative ways of thinking. I'm curious, with that quick overview of negative thinking, if anybody has any thoughts on that, if they could pop that in the chat, or any questions around that or things that come to mind for them. Okay.
Not in the chat, but I'll just say something to that, Emma, because I really love that analogy of the road and it being well grooved, and then that of the forest road. I was thinking of my French, it's the forest road.
Yes.
And so that's a really a great way to think about, your patterning and your thought process. So thank you for that.
You're right. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I like that analogy. I certainly didn't come up with the road analogy, but yeah, thinking about what are those, roads less traveled by that I could maybe think about returning to. I'm just seeing a couple of people popping stuff in the chat. So I just want to address that before I move on. So thank you, Cheryl, for saying the constant inner voice of self-criticism. Absolutely. Many of us, myself included, have a really, really noisy inner critic. And whether that's an internalized parent or outside voice or something from a previous relationship or something that just was sort of inborn, it can be really hard to work with that noisy, negative inner voice. So yes, absolutely. Acknowledging that too, and trying to separate that out from yourself can be helpful. Of this voice is telling me these negative things about myself, but I can choose to do something compassionate or kind. I'm just seeing a couple more things here. Oh, absolutely. So Sharon saying negative thinking is almost a superstition. If I don't do it, then maybe something bad will happen. So best to be prepared and go to that negative place first. Absolutely. We can get to this place where we feel like the other shoe is going to drop, or it's dangerous to feel joyful or optimistic or grateful too, that we might be taken off guard and be sort of caught out for feeling those things. Absolutely. So I think noticing those moments, obviously preparing appropriately for bad things that might happen, but also allowing yourself to lean into joy and positivity, and knowing that no amount of preparation or bracing yourself is going to probably make those bad things sting less and actually rob you of the positive, joyful moments that you do have in life. But absolutely, it can be so hard to not fall into that. I'm just going to glance through. Okay, somebody mentioned trauma. So yes, trauma is complex and so individual in terms of what sort of trauma we're talking about. In my work, I talk about big T trauma and little t trauma. So big T trauma being things like experiencing violence in your family home, going overseas and fighting in a war, experiencing sexual violence, those types of things, versus small T trauma being family conflict, going through a divorce, having things not go your way in life, that sort of thing. So how we would process those would be different depending on the individual and how the trauma is manifesting itself. And certainly you could look at patterns of thinking, but also it's sometimes appropriate to seek trauma-specific therapy with a licensed practitioner. So happy to speak to that. I feel like that's a little bit beyond the scope of this presentation, but certainly those resources are out there if you are experiencing the effects of trauma and want to discuss that.
Emma, I just have a question here, and I thought this from Nadine was really insightful.
Sure.
And you might get into this, and I don't want to sidetrack you too much on your presentation, but
Yeah.
the difference between that of a negative thinking pattern that we can get ourselves into that can kind of be habitual to that of, you know, that depressive state and anxiety state, and like how to know, yeah, I guess, you know, when it might be more of a bigger issue versus just that negative thinking pattern loop.
Sure. Yeah, that's a great question. So yeah, when does it go from sort of a normal human reaction to experiencing the world versus a more clinical thing? Yeah. I mean, certainly I'm not in the position to diagnose folks through the chat. And I actually can't diagnose within BC as a counselor. But if you're feeling like you're edging into a place of depression or you're experiencing some sort of larger mental health crisis, your GP, a walk-in clinic, a crisis line, going to a counselor who could then refer you on to a psychologist or somebody else who could provide you with a diagnosis can be helpful. And also just seeking that mental health support. So, you know, perhaps you can't get a diagnosis from a counselor, but you could learn some coping strategies to deal with those negative feelings, because certainly that's overwhelming to deal with alone and sometimes impossible if you really are in that place of clinical depression or, you know, as somebody mentioned, like the PTSD, that sort of thing that needs to be addressed alongside a practitioner or multiple practitioners.
Yeah, and I think that's so valuable to just note that as a, you know, for some people that might be joining that are experiencing that, and then also from my own, you know, I'll speak from my own personal experience, and just that cognitive behavioral therapy, which is what you offer in your workspace, is like this beautiful gift that goes hand in hand with some other supports, whether that be medication and, you know, supports within the medical field, but this kind of counseling, support groups, stuff like that are still such really strongly encouraged when people are going through mental health crisis as well. So anyway, I'm going to hand it back over to you because I'm sure I'd love to hear more on your presentation now.
Sure. Sounds good. I do just quickly want to address that last note. So how joy and hope are impossible with the feelings of isolation that come with being a caregiver. Absolutely. The caregiver burden is so gigantic, and the things that can come along with that are so massive. And I don't want to overlook that. So, you know, Kate, as that you were touching on, that might be the point where it's worthwhile to reach out to a practitioner and figure out, how can I find my way out of this? And how might joy and hope and positivity exist alongside the heaviness and the overwhelm and the depression that I'm feeling? How might both of those things be able to exist in your life? And again, that's kind of more than we can get into. And I'm sure there's individual pieces to that for many of you, but that's something I like to look at in my work. How can multiple seemingly opposing emotions or feelings or thoughts exist at once. Okay, so here are some examples of negative thinking patterns that people can fall into. So catastrophizing is a really, really common one. So having something go slightly wrong and then jumping to the worst conclusion. So for example, you're running late to a doctor's appointment, and then your mind jumps to, we're going to miss the doctor's appointment. We won't be able to get in again for 3 months. And the person that I'm caring for, their health is going to rapidly go downhill immediately. So really getting ahead of yourself and jumping to 16 steps down the road of what could go wrong, as opposed to rooting into the reality of the situation. Similarly, overgeneralizing would be just painting things with a broad strokes. So everything in my life goes wrong. This is always how it goes for me. Nothing is good. A lot of phrases like, I'm the kind of person who, so I'm the kind of person who nothing goes right for, trying to explore, is that 100% true? And then all or nothing thinking. So I see this a lot in my practice, people who either feel like they keep their home perfectly clean because they have 8 hours to clean it, or things go completely awry and there's laundry piling up and dishes in the sink and that sort of thing. So I look a lot at, how could you find one small thing to chip away at? How could you find that shade of gray or middle ground? Might it look like setting a timer for 5 minutes and seeing how many dishes you can get through, or folding one load of laundry, or, when it comes to self-care, taking a few deep breaths, even if you don't have an entire day to look after yourself, that sort of thing. Okay, so now is a reflection question, and I encourage you to pop stuff in the chat if you feel comfortable sharing. If not, feel free to just think about it independently or jot down a few notes in your home. So what patterns of negative thinking do you currently find yourself in? Okay, Amanda saying all three. Absolutely. These can all be interconnected, and we can find ourselves leaning on different patterns of negative thinking in different moments. I just want to acknowledge the previous comment from Adele, the terms big T and little t. Absolutely. So the examples I gave were maybe a bit too black and white, but something like a divorce could be a small t, trauma, inconvenience, sad thing for somebody. For somebody else, it could be big T. So absolutely, it exists on a spectrum, and I didn't mean to diminish anybody's experience there. Yeah, lack of motivation, feeling overwhelmed. Absolutely. Getting started can be the first and most overwhelming aspect of this. Keeping positive for sure. So yeah, when you're stuck in these negative ways of thinking, it can be really, really hard to find ways out. And I'm hoping to offer a few ideas of places that you could begin, or little things that you could try that hopefully would help to disrupt that pattern. Yeah, so more people saying that inner critic. Yeah, and just those patterns being so strong. I've been doing this my whole life. This is the way I've always thought. How do I change this? Yeah, thanks, Kate, for putting that in. So having others around us who are negative, it can be hard not to get sucked into that, even if we're doing our own work on positivity. Yeah, getting sucked into fear, sadness, grief. Absolutely. All of these things are so valid. Yeah, anger. For sure. And, for all of you who are family caregivers, you're being confronted always with this person that you love and care about who is sick and requires your care. So absolutely, there's a huge piece of, you're not having to seek out negativity or fall into negativity. The negativity is in front of you, and your daily life involves some negativity and heaviness. So I just want to acknowledge the reality of that. Yeah, never doing enough. Absolutely. Feeling like I'm just waiting for the next piece of bad news. So sure, that's kind of what we were touching on before, waiting for the other shoe to drop. Managing all the responsibilities, sure, that's overwhelming to feel like you need to be in charge of everything, just the sort of task overwhelm with that, I can imagine. Anticipatory grief, Brenda, thank you for putting that in there. So grief is much more complex than just losing somebody, the person no longer being alive. With somebody with a neurodegenerative disorder or loss of physical abilities or things like that, grief can actually become so much more complex. So we can be grieving, certain loss or diminishing abilities of the person that we love and care about, and be grieving those things far in advance of them actually no longer be living. Similarly, losing a relationship, like a marriage ending or having a falling out with a friend or family member and that being cut off, there can be huge amounts of grief and loss that come with that when there's no death involved. Yeah. Okay, thank you everybody for putting so much in here. In the interest of time, I am going to press on, but I just want to say thank you so much. I'm absolutely so pleased with how much you've been willing to share. And I know that it's not easy to talk about these negative things that are going on in your life. So thank you so much. And sorry that I can't acknowledge everyone's comments. Okay. So now we're going to chat a bit about challenging these negative thoughts. So this is a question or 3 questions that I use a lot in practice with folks. So asking yourself, what's the worst possible outcome? What's the best? And what is the most likely? This can be a game changer in terms of how you think about an issue, because oftentimes when we're stuck in these really negative ways of thinking, we instantly go to the worst, most extreme example. And it can be important to just take a moment to pause to think about, is there anything else that could be going on here? Could this go a different way? Could there be a neutral thing that happens from this that's maybe not as bad as what I'm anticipating? And then, what is the most likely? So rooting into reality and not just letting that inner critic or that inner worrier sort of always be in the driver's seat. And then, like I kind of briefly alluded to, so are there alternatives here? Might there be an outcome from this negative situation that you haven't even considered? We can get so locked in our own point of view and sort of get tunnel vision in the way we're thinking. And so trying to encourage yourself to look at a situation, how a friend of yours might, or how a therapist might, or a doctor, or somebody outside of your point of view can be really helpful to sort of quell some of that negativity. And also leaning on others. So, you all are dealing with very, very heavy, overwhelming, hard things. Could it be validating to join in one of the support groups that Family Caregivers BC offers? Is there another family member who is also helping you care for the person you're looking after, where you could lean on them, spelling each other off with the care of that person? And also just that emotional piece of acknowledging this is really hard. We're in a really, really difficult season of having to care for this person. Yeah, so all of those can help. And also validating the negative thoughts. So before we can change the negative thoughts or challenge them, first acknowledging where they're coming from and letting that be, giving ourselves some grace or some self-compassion around where that negativity is coming from, and then doing things to try to change it. Okay, another reflection question for you. So what are some ways you could challenge your own negative thoughts? Oh, thank you, Kate. I'm just seeing that you added a whole bunch of resources from Family Caregivers BC in there, which is great. Okay, so any thoughts on how you could challenge your own negative thoughts? Okay, great. So yeah, sharing with a trusted listener, that's one of the best things you can do. So thank you for that thought. Adele, it doesn't need to be anybody with any magic skills or training. Certainly it's wonderful to work with a qualified mental health professional, but a trusted friend, if you're part of some sort of religious or spiritual community, somebody from there might be good, another family member, something along those lines. Just having somebody who will really listen to you, validate your experience can be so helpful. And then from that place, then you can feel empowered to then go out and make some real changes. Taking a deep breath. Thank you, Jerry, for that. Absolutely. Just the impact that that can have on our nervous system, taking a deep breath and calming down, trying to get out of that frenzied way of thinking can be so helpful. Exercise, yeah, dancing, love it, love that. Support groups. Yeah, questioning, is this thought true? Yeah, taking time. Barb, thank you for commenting on that, not being mindful of not wanting to overburden people. So certainly, like, are there friends that you can lean on where you have that reciprocal relationship? Maybe they're going through something tough too, and you can really bond together around that. But then if you're feeling like I need some support beyond that, then absolutely reaching out to the FCBC groups, reaching out to a mental health professional, reaching out to your family doctor if you're lucky enough to have one, or going to a walk-in clinic, that sort of thing can be helpful. Journaling, meditation, tend to feel better when I clean the house. Yes, yeah, our physical environments can really have an impact on how we feel. Getting into nature, absolutely. Yeah, wonderful ideas, everybody. And it's so great to see you all have certain things that you can lean on. And then, yeah, absolutely getting ideas from one another. I think that's so helpful. Laughing, yes. Oh, yeah. So Ruth, the fires, absolutely. You're already dealing with the person that you're caring for and the stresses of that, and then having these external factors impacting you. Absolutely. I can acknowledge that must be a really, really trying time, particularly for those of you who are in the Okanagan and in other places that have been really impacted by fires. Your dog is a great listener. Yes. Animals can be a wonderful resource for that. Distraction. Yes, great. Okay. Thank you everybody for those wonderful, wonderful thoughts. I'm just going to continue on here so that we have time to get through everything. But yes, thank you all for sharing. Okay, so now I'm going to be chatting in a bit more specific detail about certain coping strategies you can use. So something I use a lot in session with my clients is the Cognitive Behavioural Therapy, or CBT Triangle. So we'll go through that. And then in addition to some of the practical habits that you already mentioned, I've offered a few, and some of it might be repetition. And then I'm going to give you a little bit of time towards the end of our presentation here to jot some ideas down of how you might put this into your own life. So what are the areas of your life to consider, and how might you actually implement them? Okay, so this is the CBT Triangle. In essence, CBT, or Cognitive Behavioural Therapy, looks at the interconnection between your thoughts, feelings, and behaviors, with the idea that situations come in and have an impact on all of these things, but ultimately how you respond to a situation, so what thoughts and memories come up around them and what behavioral reactions you have to them, will influence your feelings of them. So as we've mentioned previously, what can you do to modify how you're thinking about a situation? And then what behaviors can you engage in that will make you feel better? So for the thoughts, just to reiterate, could you look at, oh, I am falling into that trap of catastrophizing. Could I maybe pick up the phone and call a friend who could come in and help me here? Or is this really going to be as bad as my mind is telling me it's going to be? Similarly, behaviors, could you lean on those dog cuddles? Could you get out for a walk? Could you spend 5 minutes tidying up your kitchen? Could you take a few deep breaths, read a book before you fall asleep? Those sorts of things. And then hoping and seeing if your feelings are different based on how you react to situations. Okay.
Can I ask a question here, Emma, that just came up here, and I think it's
Sure.
I think it's relevant to that CBT triangle.
Sure. Yeah. Of
And
course.
it's from Liz, but she says that she has ways that strategies that she goes to, such as exercise, sewing, TV walks, but are doing those alternative things just a distraction to avoid a root of the problem? Or is it like, I think what I'm hearing from you, that trying to turn your attention to something else in the end could distract you, and then if it starts to resurface or the feelings are still there, that's maybe time then to investigate a little bit deeper on what you might need.
Yeah. Thank you for bringing that to my attention. And Liz, I'm sorry that I missed that, because that's such a wonderful question. So if you're one of my clients, you'll know I constantly say this phrase of both things can be true. So is distraction helpful? Yes. Is it sometimes overused and causing you to avoid the problem? Yes. So how can you use distraction to get you through the day, but then also take the time to acknowledge those deeper rooted feelings, address those issues, work through your anticipatory grief or the trauma that you're experiencing through caring for your loved one? So I think walking that tightrope can be challenging, and working with a practitioner can be helpful to figure out where you are on that spectrum, but certainly using strategies that help while also addressing those deeper things. Yeah. Does that answer your question, Kate? And then hopefully—
I think that's great. Yeah. And I like that Amanda just said that she's a dog trainer and she uses distraction to help reframe and counter a dog's emotional response. So it's almost like you're trying to pave a new path in the brain.
Yeah.
Is what I'm envisioning, and that some of the distractions can be really helpful. But what I'm also hearing is that being able to speak with a counselor or get support from other areas to kind of tease out maybe more of the emotional parts of caregiving or what you're going through can maybe start to ease those negative thoughts. And maybe they don't happen as frequently, or maybe they do, but you're working with kind of the depths of more things that if it continues to come up, but turning your attention to other things definitely supports that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, acknowledging where you're at. So if you're to the point where you're feeling panicked, overwhelmed, in fight or flight, like a lot of deep introspective work and assessing, what are the layers of my grief, is probably not going to resonate and feel that helpful if you're in that really elevated physiological state. So maybe those are the moments to reach for the walk or dancing it out in your kitchen or taking some deep breaths. And then maybe when things are feeling hard, but a little bit more calm, a little bit more accessible, then you could do that deeper work by yourself or with a practitioner. So yeah, sort of tailoring your reaction to what you feel capable of at the time.
That's great. And I'm just mindful of the time.
Yes.
12 minutes. So just meeting into that. I'm just going to mute myself now.
Sounds good. Okay. Yeah. There's only a little bit left. I want to give you all a few minutes to fill out that sheet that I did. So I'll just quickly go through some of this and then give you an opportunity to do that before we wrap up here. So you'll see on your self-care wheel, there's different areas that I have encouraged you to look at. So emotional, physical, professional, personal, psychological, and spiritual self-care. These are categories that are commonly used on this self-care wheel. If you have other categories that feel more relevant to you, absolutely, you can modify it. We've mentioned a lot of these coping strategies already, and it sounds like a lot of you are already engaging in them. So that's wonderful. Meditation, breathing, leaning on your community, and using the resources offered by FCBC, getting outside and exercising and trying to find joy even in amongst the heaviness you're dealing with. And then I'm sure there's many other things that are specific to all of you. So since we're running a little bit short on time, I'll give you 3 to 5 minutes here to just take some time to reflect and jot some stuff down on the sheet that was sent out. As we're doing this, if you'd like to pop things into the chat that you maybe didn't share before, or areas that are difficult for you to come up with ideas in, we can have a bit of a discussion alongside you working on this.
Emma, just for those people that might not have the wheel, do you have a visual of it?
There we go. Yes,
Perfect.
sorry about that. So yes, here is what everyone was emailed out. So I have filled in this on the left-hand side, just some of my ideas. And then there's the blank one to fill out too, which you could just copy onto a scrap piece of paper. My ideas are my ideas, so they're certainly not the be all end all. And I encourage you to make this really granular for yourself. So for instance, like moving your body, maybe for you, that looks like putting on Elvis and dancing around your kitchen. For other people, maybe it looks like hopping on their bike and going for a bike ride. Like really make it specific to your life and perhaps things you already do or things that you've been wanting to try and you could start thinking about doing. I just want to acknowledge something that Sharon just put in the chat. So we all need constant support and reminders of our coping strategies to counter the habitual and ever-present negative voice, especially with changes out of our control. Absolutely. You know, I'm a counselor. I talk about this every day, and I still sometimes need these reminders of, oh yeah, having a glass of water would help. Oh yeah, taking a few deep breaths would help. Maybe it's time for me to book a session with my own therapist. So certainly we can get so caught up in our day-to-day lives and forget the necessity of looking after ourselves and the necessity of using these coping strategies. So absolutely, it's normal and okay to need external reminders and people to support us with sticking with this. Respite being very important, certainly for caregivers, hard to do and find. Kate or Stacy, I'm wondering if you would be able to speak to that, how folks could access respite and how they could, like, that is such an important piece, I think, of this, to be able to go engage in these behaviors. So yeah.
Yeah, this is probably one of the top things that we talk about within our organization, within our support line. I think Licia is on, I can see her on the webinar too. She's a part of our caregiver support team as well. I think in terms of respite, yes, there are people you can pay, obviously, to have support. Not everyone is financially able to do that. And so we talk a lot within our organization about building your circle of care so that you do have people that you feel comfortable, that they know your care recipient, and maybe it's programmed into their schedule and your schedule. And obviously, we also understand that that takes a level of planning for the caregiver that can sometimes be overwhelming. But at the end of the day, having that in place is very, very important, because just like you said, Emma, to be able to kind of access some of these things within your self-care wheel, having time alone or time within community and within nature, whatever it is, and that being alone or with another person outside of your care recipient, it really is healing and important. It's actually, it's vital. So I did, and I will again put the support. Oh, Stacey just did it. Thank you, Stacey. The caregiver support line has lots of resources for specific areas within the province that you could access or consider for Respite. And also they talk about a little bit more in terms of resources about strategically building your circle of care within your group of people that you know, or even people beyond that, right? You start to kind of expand out. Oh, and thanks, Cheryl. She put a note here about Fraser Health. There's different health authorities that offer respite, and we acknowledged that during COVID that was very limited, so it was very challenging. But more so now, it's starting to be reintroduced.
Kate, there's just another question that's coming in about
from Brenda.
Yeah.
Just trying to make sense of it. Are there family care people that do check-ins for people who are on their own? Brenda, do you, maybe just for clarity, do you mean for the caregivers? Like, do our support team call caregivers and follow up? Or are you thinking about the care recipient? If you can maybe just provide a little clarity there.
Maybe while we wait for that, I just want to acknowledge what Ruth just said around expectations of her spouse's ever-changing abilities. Absolutely. That is sort of what I was touching on with that complicated grief, like grieving the person you used to be able to play tennis with, or the person you traveled with, or the person you raised children with, or whatever it might be. Like, the person might physically still be in front of you and able to do certain things, but is losing abilities in other areas. And that can be such an important piece to acknowledge. Yeah, and how to celebrate that time, be grateful for the abilities that that person still has, while also acknowledging the frustration, the sadness, the grief that comes from seeing that person's loss of abilities.
Yeah, I'm going to just encourage Brenda to call our caregiver support line. I think just having an individualized conversation about that will be really helpful. So if you're able to do that, I encourage that.
Okay, sounds good. These are great thoughts coming in from everybody. I'm curious if anybody had anything come up as they were going through the self-care wheel, like areas that were difficult for them to come up with things, or areas that they're maybe really excelling in that they hadn't acknowledged before, anything along those lines. Yeah, so Amanda saying spiritual, I find difficult to define. Certainly, if you don't follow some sort of religious practice, it can be hard to define what spirituality is for you. For some people, that's just spending time in nature or listening to music that makes them feel connected to something bigger, or reading literature that really resonates with them. So yeah, absolutely figuring that out for yourself. And I think too, maybe right sizing it, like maybe a little piece of that is enough, and the focus needs to more so be on your emotional self-care at this point, and that's okay.
Too, Emma, I think this, when I was doing this self-care wheel yesterday, I think it, for me anyway, and I know that I hear this a lot in feedback from caregivers, is that the easy part is the writing it down and like, listing. And I think it's when the rubber meets the road and it goes into practice,
Yeah.
that just acknowledging that there might be feelings of guilt, or like, I shouldn't take this time for myself, or I shouldn't do that. And that's kind of like that well-groomed pathway, right? When you're in that role of a caregiver. I know as a new mom, I found that a lot when I was trying to take time for myself, that I'd be driving away being like, I shouldn't be leaving my child. And
Right.
so it's that, acknowledgement that there might be emotions that come while you start to implement or just flex those muscles of doing some things a little bit more for yourself, because it is so important.
Yeah.
That it's still, both can be true at once. That I like that, you can go to do something that's really good for you, and you could also be feeling conflicted.
Sure. Yeah. It can be hard to get there. And acknowledging the importance of it, but then also feeling guilty about it. Absolutely. That coexisting. And then I think too, I've touched on this earlier in this presentation, but are there micro moments where you could give that to yourself? So, Kate, thank you. Like that example of being a new mom. Absolutely. Could you, while you're breastfeeding, put on a song that you really like, or, take a few deep breaths when your partner's home and you're in the shower, like giving yourself that sort of extended shower time to really care for yourself and engage in that. Or if you're preparing a meal anyways for your young child or your care recipient, could it be something that you really enjoy eating? Like, I know that these things aren't going to heal all of this, and there's so much complexity to being a caregiver, but just finding those micro moments really can compound and make a difference.
I agree. Thank you for that. I also just wanted to say, because I saw someone mention about a book, Losing Us, Dementia's Journey. And Alicia, if you're on, I feel like there is something that's happening with Rosella Leslie within our organization. I will include all the stuff in our resources follow-up. But Stacy also mentioned something really great that's happening within our organization, which is a closed Facebook support group for caregivers. And the link is there. I'll also include it in the follow-up link as well. That's been new to our organization in the last month, where people, it's more of peer-to-peer. So a lot more, and obviously it's safe and controlled, and you share what you feel. You might ask a question, but anyway, that's another, opportunity for a support system as well. Lori, it's just in there. I'll pop it in again. And then, so just in closing, I know there's lots, sorry, I'm looking at two screens. I'm seeing lots of great comments and chats, and I just am so appreciative to our community for being so forthcoming and open and vulnerable in this space, because learning about yourself and some maybe barriers to caregiving, and also, just looking at thoughts can sometimes be a little tricky. And so I think it's really a courageous and brave act, one, to show up, to start to just wonder, is there a different way I can maybe start to manage? And just those small steps can really make a big difference in the long run.
Yeah, absolutely. I would echo what Kate said. I see so many people in my practice who say, I've waited years, I've waited decades to reach out for help. So the fact that you signed up for this and showed up for this today in whatever capacity you could is a huge vote in that direction of change and vulnerability and willingness to grow a little bit. So yeah, absolutely. I know we are running short on time here, perhaps a little bit over. If anybody has any final questions, perhaps Kate, we could follow up afterwards. I think that my website is listed on this. Yeah, and my contact information can be found through my website. So if you have things that this sparked or specific questions that came out of today, I'm more than happy to reply after this time.
Great, and yeah, and they can find your other resources there too. And I'll be sending a follow-up email. It will come via Zoom, but within that will be our link for, and I'm going to put it right now, just because I'm always so appreciative to those people that are able to give feedback to our webinars. And so there's a survey. It should take around 5 to 7 minutes to fill out, just on the presentation, the topics, and it really does help inform who I bring on to talk about these important topics and what it is that you want to learn more about within our organization. And we're here to support you as caregivers. And so that will go out, it's in the chat box now, but it will also go out tomorrow morning with all the resources, some of Emma's PowerPoint deck, and also her contact information if you'd like to follow up with her on your own. And then also, obviously, caregiver support groups are always running monthly within our organization, and our caregiver support line is a Monday to Friday, 8:30 to 4 p.m. Toll-free line for you to call if you need someone to just listen or give you some support or resources. That is why we are there. So I see people logging off. I just will hop on and just take a look. I don't see any specific questions that in terms of closing. Thank you so much for your time and your resources and your expertise in this, and also your own, vulnerability and humanness around the topic, because it does make it, we're all going through some of the same emotions and thought patterning, and so it's nice to know that there's different ways to manage. So I appreciate your time and your expertise.
Yeah, my pleasure. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you truly everybody for participating so much.
Got a lot of thank yous. And okay, with that, we will be signing off. Thank you. And I hope to see you all in another event. Bye.